To our very last presentation lecture in the Walks and Talks on UVM Wildside series. I hope that many of you have been to the many amazing lectures and accompanying field walks that have been offered over the course of the last 6 months. And I want to remind everyone that there actually is one more event, and it is tomorrow. The Natural Area's 50th anniversary celebration will be happening at the Davis Center up on the fourth floor in the Grand Maple Ballroom. It's going to be a great set of presentations and talks on the history of the natural areas and its utility for a whole variety of different efforts and research activities. There's going to be a great keynote talk by Ethan Tapper on forestry and how to use the UVM natural areas as a living laboratory. So I encourage all of you to come either in person, but there's also a virtual link available for that celebration as well. I am Sarah Helms-Cahan. I am the Associate Vice President for Research at UVM, also a faculty member in biology. I'm standing in for Josh Benesh, who couldn't be here to do the presentation tonight. But it's my pleasure to introduce our lecturer for the evening, Dr. Mindy Morales. And Dr. Morales joined the UVM faculty in 2017 after getting her PhD at Iowa State University in 2016 and doing a postdoctoral position at the University of Minnesota. She is a newly minted associate professor in the Rubenstein School of the Environment and Natural Resources, which I know because I saw her at the faculty recognition dinner just last night when she received the recognition for that promotion and tenure. She's also the acting director of the Rubenstein Ecosystem Science Laboratory. So anybody who came this past weekend to the walk associated with this talk, you would have met her and learned about the Rubenstein Science Lab. Maybe many of you are thinking, what is it that happens that's formative in the life of a person to make them think, wow, I really want to do science and I want to make it my career? Dr. Morales has a very interesting story about that because one of her first jobs as an undergraduate researcher at Florida International University in Miami was actually, she says, and I quote, sitting on alligators and covering their eyes while they are being tagged in the Everglades. And that sounds to me like an experience that would have set me on the path, either really into science or really away from science, depending on my experience that day. But obviously, it was a very rewarding one. And so we are going to be hearing from her tonight to talk about climate change in Lake Champlain. And I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Yeah, that was definitely a formative experience. And it turns out when you cover alligators' eyes, they do, in fact, calm down. And I had to
I
just.
can't hear you, Mindy.
Mm-hmm.
This is something we should have checked.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Hmm.
I am able to hear you, Mindy.
You can hear me?
Yeah.
You don't seem to be muted.
Okay, I'm not. I don't
I
think I
can hear you
am.
fine as well.
Okay,
I
so
can hear
maybe.
you.
Great,
I can hear you.
great. Okay, Sarah, can you? I wonder if Sarah can hear other people. Well, what do you think, Nakashi? Can you message Sarah and ask if she can hear?
I'm doing it right now.
Okay. Just give it a second.
Oh,
good.
I think you can go ahead, Mindy.
What's that? I can go ahead?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, great. All right. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for being here tonight. And thanks, Sarah, for the nice introduction. So tonight I'm going to talk a bit about climate change in Lake Champlain, but also how climate change is affecting lakes globally, and where Lake Champlain fits into those larger scale patterns. Oops. Uh-oh. There we go. And so I often say, or limnologists often say, that lakes are canaries of the landscape. And that's just because lakes respond a lot more quickly to climate pressure than terrestrial landscapes. And so when things are happening and changing quickly in lakes, we know that there are pretty significant large-scale patterns happening that are driving those changes. Where, in a forest, it might take many years and many decades to see rapid changes. In a lake, we can see those things on much shorter time scales. And so they really act as a barometer for large-scale global change. And so these are the types of things I work on. And so the major kind of research questions that my research group focuses on are around the balance of seasonality in lakes and disturbance processes. And so when I say seasonality, I mean things like phenological processes. So, often when we think about seasonal processes, we think about leaves changing or, seasons and things like that. But lakes have seasons as well. And these include winter ice cover, spring melt, fall or spring lake mixing, and seasonal succession of different types of organisms in lakes. And so when we predict things and predict ecosystem function in lakes, we often use this seasonality or these types of phenology to say, okay, well, we expect these organisms to be here at this time, or we expect the lake to be a certain temperature at this time. But climate change and increasing disturbance processes, including things like heat waves, extreme storm events, floods, intermittent ice cover, intermittent lake mixing, can disrupt these seasonal progressions or phenology in lake ecosystems. And so I'm really interested in where are the tipping points, or at what point do the forcing effects of increased disturbance due to climate change, outweigh these effects of seasonality, and how do we need to change our predictive models for what lakes are going to do in the future based on these disturbance processes. And this is really important because both of these things have important effects on ecosystem function. And, that includes things, properties of lake ecosystems like biodiversity, primary productivity, how organisms assemble and who's there and when, how the lake breathes and emits or takes up greenhouse gases, and how nutrients are cycled, and all kinds of different toxicity in lakes. And so I work on these questions at local and regional scales. So these are some images of Vermont lakes, Lake Champlain up in the top left corner, a nice picture of Shelburne Pond with my dog on the right side, and some other Vermont inland lakes. I also think about them at global scales, working with a group called the Global Lake Ecological Observatory Network, where we leverage many lakes and many limnologists across the globe to ask these larger scale questions, thinking about, what's affecting lakes globally, rather than looking only at Lake Champlain. We can say, we can scale those questions and think about larger scale processes. And so there's many, many different effects that climate change has on lake ecosystems, varying from, physical processes to biological processes and chemical cycling. And so the plot you're looking at on your screen right now is a summary of observed changes that are attributed to climate change across freshwater ecosystems. And this was produced by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change sixth assessment report a couple years ago in 2022. And so the triangle just represent the direction of change, and the color of the triangle represents the confidence level of the change based on the data available across systems. And so you can see, we know that surface water temperatures across freshwater ecosystems are increasing globally. That's leading to a change in thermal regimes. There's a large-scale shift in or decrease in ice duration. Oxygen concentrations are decreasing. The length of the growing season in lakes is increasing. Cyanobacteria blooms in most cases are increasing. Lake productivity associated with cyanobacteria blooms is also increasing. So you see there's a pretty substantial range of changes and impacts that climate change is known to have across lakes. And so then I just want to draw your attention to this line here, which is temperate lakes. And That's where we are in the world. Most of our lakes are, or all of our lakes are temperate lakes. And so you can see right away that temperate and boreal lakes a little farther north of us are having the most pronounced changes across all of these categories, right? And so it's really urgent and really important that we understand these dynamic processes now, because they're happening very quickly in our systems, which are very sensitive to them. And so if you're here, I don't have to tell you the value of lakes, right? You already care a lot about lakes, but they're quite important on the planet. And so for things like drinking water, we draw our drinking water from Lake Champlain for recreation, for fisheries, and various types of human health. But they're not just there for, human ecosystem services. They're also really important dynamic integrators of watershed inputs. So they're not just pipes on the landscape that go downstream to the ocean. They do a lot of things as water moves through them on the way downstream. They cycle nutrients, they process and store carbon and transport carbon. They mediate greenhouse gas emissions, so things like carbon dioxide, methane, and other things. And they turn out, because of these things, to be a really important, have a very important role in the global carbon cycle. But climate change, all those things that I showed you on the previous plot, is threatening all of these processes and amplifying the rate that lakes process carbon and nutrients. And so what I want to start with, and I don't have my notes, but that's okay. Okay, so what I want to start with is the effects of physical processes on lakes. And so, climate change can have a variety of direct and indirect effects on lake ecosystem function, but perhaps the most obvious and measurable one is a change in lake surface temperatures, and then how that affects thermal regimes in lakes. And so I want to start by giving you just a little introduction to how a lake mixes, excuse me, in case you're not familiar with this. And so in our region, many lakes are what we call dimictic lakes, meaning they fully mix twice a year, once in the spring and once in the fall, including Lake Champlain. Fall mixing tends to occur due to a shortening day length and cooling temperatures in the fall, where spring mixing is more due to ice melt. And so as the ice melts and that cool water causes the full water column to mix. This happens for a couple different reasons. A big reason is that 4 degrees Celsius water, what you see here at the bottom of the lake, is the most dense water, meaning it's heavy. And so as this upper layer cools and becomes more dense and more dense and more cool, then with increasing winds in the fall, that'll shift that cold, dense water down and cause the full water column to mix. And so those density gradients, keep that in your mind for later slides, end up being really important in how a lake functions. And so that's what a lake looks like in the summer. So you have this warmer surface water, an area of rapid change called the thermocline, and then cooler water on the bottom. And it takes a lot of energy to mix those two layers. And so the upper layer is cycling, the bottom layer is cycling, and they don't really mix when the lake is stratified. But then if we move into the fall, as I was saying, as temperatures cool and the day length is shorter, that surface water becomes colder and eventually becomes what we call isothermal, so the same temperature from the top to bottom. And I have 4 degrees Celsius here because, again, that's the densest water, or 3.98, I think, is the highest density of water. And so then from the fall, generally we would have winter ice cover, right? And the temperature in the lake looks a little different over winter, where we have what's called inverse stratification. So it's a little colder at the top of the lake where there's ice. This ice is the least dense, so it floats, right? And then we would expect that 4 degrees Celsius water that's very dense to be below that. When the lake melts, then you have the lake going isothermal again, 4 degrees or something close to 4 degrees from top to bottom. And that's what's driving your spring mixing. And that spring mixing event is really important in cycling nutrients and oxygen through the water column, particularly things like silica, which fuels spring diatom blooms, a type of algae that are a very important food source for zooplankton and fish and things, and fuel the food web for the rest of the year. So that spring mixing event is really a critical time in a dimictic lake that determines what the rest of the year looks like in terms of full lake productivity and metabolism. And then from spring, as things warm, the surface water warms, then you get that thermal stratification setting up again. And so now you've gone through your two mixing events in a dimictic lake. And so why am I talking about this? Well, so I mentioned that the spring melt is really what drives, spring melt is what drives that spring mixing event. But in Lake Champlain, we know that the lake is freezing less frequently and the duration of ice is less frequent. And so over time, we're getting less and less ice cover in Lake Champlain, which is related to surface water warming, but it's also affecting the mixing and stability of the lake. And so it mixes later in the year and tends to stay warmer generally throughout the year. And so in the deep lake, in the main lake, where, at a point that's around 95 meters to 100 meters, we know that the surface water is warming, and it's been warming, it's warmed about 4 degrees Celsius since the 1940s in some parts of the lake in the deep water. And so this trend is from relatively short-term data just over the past 25 years from the Lake Champlain long-term monitoring program. But these trends are much longer trends. But interestingly, at 95 meters in the main lake, the bottom temperature is stable. And so if you remember what I was talking about these density gradients, that's important because as temperatures diverge, the density between the two layers is greater, and it makes it harder and harder for the lake to fully mix. And so, as I said this just a second ago, surface water temperatures have increased nearly 4 degrees in parts of the lake since 1940. And this is altering that stratification and mixing patterns and decreasing ice cover. We're also seeing, some indirect effects on the lake, which include more intense storm events. So these floods that we've had over the past 2 years, and also intermittent heat waves and other types of flushing events that change lake temperature patterns and the rate, timing, and amount of nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus that enter the lake. And so this can cause things like erosion, combined sewer overflows, big pulses of nutrients, and increase annual nutrient loads. And so I think in the flood 2 years ago, we got something like the annual load of phosphorus to the lake in just a few days. And so can have a pretty substantial impact on lake ecosystem function. And so these trends, they're not isolated to Lake Champlain. We're seeing them globally and across the Northeast. And so these plots are from a paper by Isabella Oleski and Dave Richardson that came out last year, looking at, these are lakes in New York. And they saw similar trends as what we're seeing in Lake Champlain, where surface water is warming slightly, but there bottom water is decreasing significantly over time, both in across all seasons. And so there they saw slightly different trends between spring and summer. And so again, this is kind of reinforcing those patterns where as temperatures are diverging more and more in lakes, because lakes are staying more stable, that bottom water can remain cooler or get cooler. And while surface water is warming, it creates a positive feedback where it's harder and harder for a lake to mix and they become more stable over time. And so, so these are kind of single variable effects on of climate change on lakes, but we know that it's not just a single driver that causes climate-related changes in lakes. From that same paper, we know that there are things called climate teleconnections, which are synergistic effects of climate change that can influence regional variables and lake temperatures. And so these are larger scale climate shifts um, um, in oscillation patterns like the North Atlantic Oscillation, which influences spring temperature and precipitation. It creates things like rain on snow events. And those drive air temperatures, precipitation, solar radiation, and wind. And so don't worry too much about everything that's going on in these plots on the right side of the screen, but the take home from them is that these interactive effects of climate change influence and then changes in regional weather variables are driving increases in lake stability. So ST here is a metric of lake stability and that those differences in thermal layers. And so we're seeing increased stability and increased duration of the length of stratification in lakes. So that stratified summer period is increasing. And so a new project I'm working on with some collaborators associated with the Global Lake Ecological Observatory Network, or GLEON, is looking at how these changing winter dynamics will influence lake phenology and ecosystem function across the United States and Canada and Europe. And so we're really interested in how, oops, I changed the slide too soon. So we're interested in how as ice becomes more intermittent or shorter duration, will lakes shift from dimictic with long ice cover to delayed and intermittent, or just to warm monomictic, so they only mix once a year? And then we're interested in how that's going to affect particularly cyanobacteria blooms and toxicity, but also things like lake metabolism, so how lakes breathe and take up and release oxygen and dissolve gases to the atmosphere. And so what we're predicting is that we're going to see a range shift for temperate lakes. And so you might have heard about range shifts in things like moose or sugar maples, whereas things are warmer at lower latitudes, things have to shift north. Well, lakes can have range shifts as well. And so this is driven by decreased ice cover, extended periods of stratification, extended growing seasons, increased primary production. It results in increased primary production, increases in cyanobacteria blooms, and depleted oxygen in bottom waters. And so we have about 30 lakes across the country that we're monitoring and comparing what's happening over time to see if these processes are at work. And in fact, lakes are shifting as ice duration is decreasing. So I mostly talked so far about direct effects of warming, but we know that there's some pretty significant synergistic effects of extreme events in lakes across lakes globally. And so we've observed increases in, as I said before, heat waves, intense storms, floods, lower water levels, and cyanobacteria blooms. So the map you're looking at on the left-hand side of the screen is from a new paper by Woolway et al. From Nature Communications, where they characterize the increase globally in heat waves and algal blooms and in low water levels. And so there's clearly a discrete increase in each of those variables, but the important take home of that paper is that there's also an increase in the synergistic or co-occurrence of all these variables across lakes worldwide. And so it turns out it's these effects are in a way being amplified across lakes. And so it's not, we can't fully understand the changes that are happening in lakes by only looking at storm events or only looking at heat waves, because these things are co-occurring and causing additive effects on lake ecosystem function. Okay, so now I want to tell you a little bit about some recent research. My former PhD student, Caitlin Warner, who just defended, who's now Dr. Warner, looked at in the shallow bays of Lake Champlain. And so she was interested in the interactive effects of extreme events on bloom formation and toxicity in the Northeast Arm. And so I talked a little about the main lake, but the Northeast Arm functions very differently from the main lake. And so these bays are relatively shallow and what we call polymictic, meaning they mix frequently because they're shallow. And so they're very susceptible and sensitive to wind and disturbance events and other kind of flushing events. And so they function a bit differently and have a different sensitivity to climate change impacts, particularly to these disturbance processes. And so Kate wanted to know how do antecedent conditions affect how cyanobacteria respond in lakes in these bays when there's a big storm event. And so, as you'll probably notice from these plots, her results were pretty variable. And so I'll just walk you through what they mean quickly. And so on the y-axis, so on your left-hand side, you have a measure of phycocyanin, which is a proxy for cyanobacteria biomass. The bars, the different colored bars across the plot, the blue indicate there was a flushing event. The red indicate there was a heat wave. And so those solid lines are that metric for cyanobacteria biomass. The dotted lines are a metric for all algae, all phytoplankton. And so these are results from Missisquoi Bay from between 2018 and 2021. And generally what she found was that cyanobacteria biomass increased following a flushing event that was preceded by a long stable period or a heat wave. And it was a little bit inconsistent, but the general trend or the general antecedent conditions were these longer periods of stability that led to an increase in cyanobacteria when there was an extreme event. In St. Albans Bay, results were a little bit different. St. Albans Bay is slightly deeper than Missisquoi Bay and has slightly different watershed inputs. And so she found similar trends, but there were more independent flushing events that weren't preceded by extended stable periods that resulted in cyanobacteria blooms. And we think that has to do with the different watershed inputs and just the basin morphometry in St. Albans Bay. But then one additional interesting result, so she was also measuring cyanotoxins, and she did some genomics work that I won't share with you today, but she also found that cyanotoxins tended to increase following nutrient pulses. So when we had these big flushing events, well, two things. Cyanobacteria biomass didn't necessarily scale with toxins. So when we found the highest concentrations of toxins, and these data from 2021, they generally lagged cyanobacteria biomass. So you'd have a large biomass peak, and then the toxins would come after as the bloom was breaking down and dying. But the toxins and the biomass tended to follow a large pulse of nutrients. I'm not sure what's happening here. My computer is doing what it wants. There we go. Okay. Yeah, so those flushing events in those two eutrophic bays ended up being very important, variable in biomass, but really important in driving the concentration of toxins, both anatoxin, which is a neurotoxin, and microcystin, which is a toxin produced by cyanobacteria that affects liver function. And those are just, So this one, this first plot was showing you pulses of nitrogen concentrations, total nitrogen in surface and bottom waters of Missisquoi Bay and St. Albans. And then this one is showing you phosphorus inputs, phosphorus pulses, and similar trends. Okay. So I think I went a little fast. I apologize for that. But the take-home message, or the take-home that I want you to remember from the talk tonight is that globally lakes are changing pretty rapidly in response to interacting climate change pressure, both direct and indirect effects. In Lake Champlain, ice cover and duration are decreasing. And Champlain is warming, but the deep water is remaining stable, or temperatures in deep water are stable, and that's increasing long-term stability in the lake. And we see variable effects of climate change across the lake basins, where the shallow bays are generally more sensitive to extreme events than the deep lake. All right, and with that, I'll thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Mindy. And if anybody would like to ask any questions, you can either raise a hand or do some other reaction, and Mindy will be able to call on you. Or if you want to just put a question right into the chat, that's another great way to do it.
Any questions?
Nope. Other than we're doomed.
Oh, no.
That's not a question.
There's a question for you in the chat, and I will just read it. Do they know which toxins are related to ALS? I've heard that lakes may affect ALS. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, so those, so that research is really preliminary, I would say. And the toxins that are thought to be related to ALS it's something called BMAA. Don't ask me what the acronym stands for. But yeah, I would say there is not, I don't feel like there's very strong evidence or direct evidence that this, what am I trying to say? That the cause is the cyanotoxins. There are correlations between eutrophic lakes and communities that have ALS, but there's a lot of confounding factors. And so I'd hesitate to say that for sure they're causing ALS. I think there's still a lot of research that needs to be done. But that's a good question.
There's another question. Are the Great Lakes being studied in a similar way? And if so, are there similar developments or changes that are observed there?
Yeah, great question. I wanted to put a bunch of Great Lakes stuff in here too, but I thought, yeah, trying to focus on Champlain. Yeah, the Great Lakes and Champlain, which is a pretty good lake too, is we're hydrologically connected to the Great Lakes, and so we have very similar things happening. One of the big ones is interactive effects of non-native species invasions over time, paired with climate change pressure. And so yes, the Great Lakes vary a bit in their depth, morphometry, and so some effects are slightly different than Lake Champlain, which is a more shallower system than some of the Great Lakes. But yes, we're seeing a lot of similar trends, and there's extensive studies being done in the Great Lakes.
One more question that's in the chat. In warm weather or tropical environments, do the temperature reversals function in the same way as they do in temperate lakes?
Yeah, great question. And so in tropical lakes, so lakes like the African Great Lakes, Rift Valley lakes, there are similar processes happening. These are much deeper lakes that tend to stay stably stratified. And what's happening in lakes like Lake Tanganyika, so they don't have freeze-thaw cycles, right? But they have rainy seasons and dry seasons. And as the lake warms, stability is increasing, and coastal upwelling or upwelling of nutrients is decreasing. And so the lakes are decreasing in productivity. Fisheries productivity is decreasing because the lake is staying much more stable. Yeah, so slightly different, but similar processes.
One more question. The South Lake and the shallower bays generally do ice over. Are their characteristics significantly different, presumably from the main part of the lake?
Yeah, well, there's a couple things driving that. So the shallower bays, yes, will ice over because they're shallower. And also it has to do a bit with prevailing winds and how far along the lake winds can travel and energy they can build up. But yes, generally around the periphery, things will freeze, but it's the main open lake that won't fully freeze over anymore. Yeah.
I have another question actually. So at the beginning of your talk, you had a image going from more polar and cold, more seasonal lakes all the way down to those that never freeze over. And right in the middle is that more intermittent freezing,
Yeah.
right? And I'm wondering, is there a critical tipping point where you make that switch to now you have this mixing that happens all the time, which strikes me as when there is going to be a systemic impact on the living species that occur throughout the lake. Is there a tipping point like that? And are there lakes that currently are going through that state change?
So that is the question that we're investigating right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I would say we think the answer is yes, that lakes are going through that right now. Many of the lakes that we chose for that study, so that's an NSF funded study that started last year. And many of the lakes we chose for that study, we had planned extensive ice sampling to go out and measure processes under the ice, and many just didn't freeze last year. And so we said, well, maybe things are already advancing, but that's 1 year. So yes, I certainly around, you know, like the lower range of the temperate region, things are shifting for sure. And there does seem to be a critical point, but TBD, we'll tell you in 3 to 5 years.
Yeah. Oh, it's amazing to think that it would happen like over that time span, that you could actually see that state shift in real time is quite a scary sort of
it is
time frame.
scary. Yeah.
We have a hand raised. David, if you want to ask your question.
Yes, sorry. Thank you for this talk. I was wondering if there's any correlation or studies done about conductivity and salinity, specifically from like road salts and things that are being put onto the highways, and how that might affect the lake and whether that affects these processes.
Yeah, great question. Absolutely. Well, so salinity increases the density of water, and so it's sort of an additive effect to increasing temperatures. So we've done work with Glion looking at large scale trends in salinity across lakes in the United States, and found that if a lake has a very small amount, as little as 1% impervious surface within a 150-meter buffer of their watershed, then they're at risk of long-term salinization. So, thousands of lakes across the country are at risk of long-term salinization. Lake Champlain is one of them and has increased in salinity over the past several decades. And so, yeah, that is an additional concern that changes the density and reduces mixing in lakes.
We have another question in the chat. Is there an explanation for why cyanobacteria blooms are toxic sometimes and not other times?
Yeah, we're working on it. The former PhD student, Kate Warner, that I mentioned, she has been doing some genomics work to try to figure out specifically which strains are more or less responsible for toxin production. And so some of the dominant bloom formers that we have in Lake Champlain actually don't produce toxins, which is a good thing. And so we tend to have relatively lower concentrations of toxins than some other comparable lakes. But she thinks it also has to do with some ratios of nutrients required for growth and required to produce certain toxins. And so different types of nutrient limitation, whether they need nitrogen or phosphorus and whatever combination, can determine what toxins they produce. But it's a hard question, and a lot of people are working on that and trying to figure out how to predict when exactly a bloom is toxic and when it's dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right, I have another question. I work in terrestrial systems, and so in terrestrial systems, we think a lot about how close a species is to its upper thermal limit. And so how much warming they can take before there are really serious direct negative effects of temperature. And I'm curious how that safety margin looks for aquatic species in temperate lakes.
Yeah, so I work on I'm a biogeochemist and I'm a phycologist. So I work on algae primarily and some bacteria. And so I can say for phytoplankton, for algae, it's a pretty narrow range. We're doing some work right now in our lab testing those trait thresholds of different types of algae, trying to predict exactly that same question, like which ones are going to be successful under these certain climate scenarios. And cyanobacteria end up being really happy in warm water and can tolerate these larger temperature thresholds than most eukaryotic algae, not cyanobacteria. Yeah.
Wow. So you expect to see quite a community shift as you get warmer. Even subtle warming might lead to something pretty dramatic in the phytoplankton community. That's awesome. I mean, not awesome. You know what I mean.
I do. Science awesome, but not,
Right.
Yes, I get it.
Are there any other questions? I'm not seeing any more in the chat. All right. Well, thank you so much, Mindy, for such a really fascinating talk about a system that we all live next to, but we don't really recognize often what is happening beneath the waves. So really, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
And thanks to all of you for coming. Have a wonderful evening.